The Congo Crisis and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. The Congo Crisis began immediately after the Democratic Republic of Congo gained independence from Belgium on June 30, 1960, and quickly spiraled into a catastrophic geopolitical conflict fueled by Cold War tensions, imperial greed, and U.S. paranoia. The central figure was Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, a charismatic nationalist who sought to maintain Congo's sovereignty and utilize its immense mineral wealth, especially in Katanga, for the benefit of its people. However, his pan-Africanist stance and outreach to the Soviet Union for assistance during internal unrest alarmed Western powers, especially the United States under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The CIA, fearing that Lumumba would become Africa's Castro, launched covert operations to undermine him. Declassified documents later confirmed that Eisenhower approved Lumumba's assassination during a National Security Council meeting in August 1960. Lumumba was captured in January 1961, tortured, and executed by Congolese rivals with the complicity of Belgian officers and indirect CIA support. After his death, the US and Belgium helped install and maintain Mobutu Sese Seko, a pro-Western military dictator who ruled with brutal authoritarianism for over 30 years, plunging the country into economic ruin, human rights abuses, and widespread corruption. The US provided Mobutu with millions in aid, military training, and diplomatic backing, despite knowing his regime was oppressive and kleptocratic. The Congo Crisis is a textbook case of Cold War-era neocolonialism, where U.S. foreign policy sacrificed African lives and sovereignty in the name of containing communism, leading to one of the most tragic betrayals of African independence and self-determination in the 20th century. The Angolan Civil War. The Angolan Civil War was one of the longest and deadliest conflicts in modern African history, and it became a brutal Cold War proxy war that devastated Angola for nearly 3 decades, with direct involvement from multiple U.S. administrations. When Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975, 3 major factions, MPLA, Marxist-Leninist, UNITA, anti-communist, and FNLA, vied for control of the country. The MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, took control of the capital, Luanda, and declared itself the ruling party, prompting the U.S., under President Gerald Ford, to covertly fund and arm the UNITA rebels led by Jonas Savimbi through the CIA. This support intensified under President Jimmy Carter, but reached its peak under President Ronald Reagan, who viewed Angola as a key front in the global fight against communism. Reagan's administration funneled tens of millions of dollars to Savimbi, portraying him as a freedom fighter, even though UNITA committed countless atrocities, including massacres of civilians, use of child soldiers, and destruction of infrastructure. The war drew in regional powers. South Africa, then under apartheid, supported UNITA with ground troops and airstrikes, while Cuba deployed over 36,000 soldiers to support the MPLA. The result was a full-scale war that left over 500,000 people dead, millions displaced, and Angola's economy and society in ruins. Despite mounting evidence that Savimbi was more of a warlord than a liberator, the U.S. continued backing him well into the 1990s, including during George H.W. Bush's administration, prolonging the war even after the Cold War had ended. It wasn't until Savimbi was killed in 2002 that the Civil War finally came to an end. U.S. involvement in Angola was driven not just by Cold War ideology, but also by strategic interests in the country's vast oil and diamond reserves. The legacy of this war is still felt today, as Angola struggles with poverty, landmine contamination, and deep political wounds. The U.S. role in fueling this tragedy is a stark reminder of how superpower interference in Africa has often prioritized ideology and resource control over African lives and stability. U.S. support for apartheid South Africa. The apartheid regime in South Africa, which formally began in 1948, was a white supremacist system of institutionalized racial segregation and oppression that lasted for nearly 5 decades, during which the United States government, under several administrations from Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan, played a complicit role by prioritizing geopolitical and economic interests over human rights. Despite the regime's brutal repression of the black majority, marked by forced removals, the banning of black political organizations, mass imprisonment, torture, and state-sanctioned murder, the U.S. maintained strong diplomatic, military, and economic ties with the apartheid government. During the Cold War, U.S. foreign policy was primarily guided by anti-communist sentiment, and the South African government, with its capitalist economy and strategic location, was viewed as a valuable ally in the fight against Soviet influence in Africa, even as global outrage over apartheid grew. And while countries like Sweden and the Soviet Union supported liberation movements like the African National Congress, ANC, and Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, the U.S. labeled the ANC a terrorist organization and refused to support sanctions. Under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. adopted adopted a policy of constructive engagement, arguing that private dialogue and investment would lead to reform, while in practice continuing arms trade, intelligence cooperation, and corporate investments that propped up the apartheid regime. Reagan even vetoed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986, which aimed to impose economic sanctions on South Africa. Congress had to override his veto in a rare bipartisan move after immense public pressure. During this time, leaders like Nelson Mandela remained imprisoned, and any resistance was met with violent crackdowns. Although later administrations, particularly under George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, began shifting toward open support for a post-apartheid transition, the decades-long support of white minority rule by earlier U.S. presidents contributed significantly to the longevity and brutality of apartheid. The U.S. profited from the exploitation of South African gold, uranium, and labor, while ignoring the human cost inflicted on millions of black South Africans. This dark chapter reveals how the U.S., while claiming to be a global defender of freedom, actively enabled racial tyranny when it suited its strategic interests. The 1986 U.S. bombing of Libya, Operation El Dorado Canyon. In April 1986, under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan, the United States launched a massive aerial bombing campaign against Libya, known as Operation El Dorado Canyon, marking one of the most aggressive direct U.S. military actions on the African continent during the Cold War. This operation was in response to the April 5, 1986 bombing of a discotheque in West Berlin, which killed 3 people, including a U.S. serviceman, and injured over 200 others. The Reagan administration swiftly blamed Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, accusing him of sponsoring international terrorism, and used intercepted communications as justification for military retaliation, though the legitimacy of this evidence remains contested. On April 15, 1986, U.S. warplanes from the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps struck Tripoli and Benghazi, targeting military barracks, airfields, and what they claimed were terrorist-related facilities. However, the bombings also hit civilian areas, including Gaddafi's family compound, resulting in the deaths of dozens of civilians, including Gaddafi's adopted 15-month-old daughter. Gaddafi himself narrowly survived the attack. The bombing sparked global outrage, with critics accusing the U.S. of violating international law and using excessive force, especially since no formal investigation had proven Libya's direct involvement in the Berlin bombing. The African Union, Arab League, and much of the international community condemned the attack, seeing it as yet another example of U.S. imperialism and disregard for African sovereignty. The operation hardened anti-American sentiment in Libya and across Africa, further isolating the U.S. diplomatically in many parts of the global south. Rather than neutralizing Gaddafi, the bombing emboldened him to continue his anti-Western rhetoric and ramp up internal repression. Though Reagan hailed the mission as a success in fighting terrorism, many historians and analysts argue that it fueled a cycle of violence and retribution, laying the groundwork for deeper instability in the region. This act also set a precedent for future U.S. military interventions under the guise of counterterrorism, regardless of civilian casualties or long-term consequences. The 1986 Libya bombing stands as a turning point in U.S.-Africa relations, highlighting how American presidents have often resorted to force first, without accountability or a plan for peace. Somalia intervention and the Black Hawk Down disaster. The U.S. military intervention in Somalia during the early 1990s is one of the most infamous examples of American foreign policy failures in Africa, where a mission cloaked in humanitarian rhetoric descended into bloodshed, chaos, and long-term instability. The operation began under President George H.W. Bush in 1992 as a response to a devastating famine and civil war following the collapse of Somalia's government in 1991. Initially framed as a UN-backed humanitarian mission, Operation Restore Hope, to deliver food and aid, U.S. forces were sent in with the intent of stabilizing the region and ensuring relief reached the starving population. However, the situation quickly deteriorated as American troops became entangled in Somalia's complex clan-based civil war. By the time President Bill Clinton took office in 1993, the mission had expanded into a military operation to capture Somali warlords, particularly Mohammed Farah Aidid, whose militia had attacked UN peacekeepers. On October 3 to 4, 1993, U.S. Army Rangers and Delta Force operatives launched a mission to seize Aidid's top lieutenants in Mogadishu, but the operation went disastrously wrong. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down, and a fierce 18-hour urban battle ensued, resulting in the deaths of of 18 American soldiers, the wounding of over 70, and the deaths of hundreds of Somali civilians, many caught in the crossfire or indiscriminately killed in retaliatory U.S. fire. The haunting images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu shocked the American public and led to a swift political backlash. Within months, Clinton ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and by 1994, the mission had fully collapsed. The incident, immortalized in the book and film Black Hawk Down, left a lasting stain on U.S. military credibility in Africa and directly influenced the U.S. decision to not intervene during the Rwandan Genocide the following year. The Somalia intervention exposed the dangers of military missions without a deep understanding of local dynamics, and while the original goal may have been humanitarian, the result was increased resentment, civilian deaths, and a prolonged period of lawlessness and suffering for Somalia. It also ushered in a new era where U.S. engagement in Africa would largely shift from boots on the ground to drone strikes, intelligence operations, and shadow warfare, leaving behind scars that have yet to fully heal. The Rwandan Genocide. The Rwandan Genocide of 1994 stands as one of the most horrifying mass atrocities of the 20th century, where an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were systematically slaughtered in just 100 days, and the role of the United States, under President Bill Clinton, is remembered not for what it did, but for its catastrophic failure to act. The genocide was orchestrated by the extremist Hutu government following the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana when his plane was shot down on April 6, 1994, triggering a wave of pre-planned massacres across the country. Radio broadcasts incited mobs to kill their Tutsi neighbors with machetes, clubs, and guns, while roadblocks and mass killings engulfed entire towns. Despite clear signs of an unfolding genocide, including intelligence warnings, satellite imagery, and reports from aid workers and UN forces on the ground, the Clinton administration chose not to intervene, going so far as to avoid using the word genocide publicly, because under the UN Genocide Convention, such a term would legally require action. Instead, the US pushed to withdraw UN peacekeepers at the height of the violence, hampering international response and effectively giving the green light to the killers. Internal documents later revealed that top US officials, including those in the State Department and National Security Council, were fully aware of the scale and intent of the atrocities, yet prioritized avoiding another Somalia-style military fiasco over saving lives. Clinton later admitted that his administration's inaction was one of his greatest regrets, but apologies couldn't bring back the hundreds of thousands of lives lost or the generations traumatized. The US not only failed to stop the genocide, it actively obstructed international intervention, lobbied against jamming hate radio broadcasts, and delayed humanitarian support. This moment became a defining symbol of Western hypocrisy. While America portrayed itself as a global champion of human rights, it stood by as one of the most preventable genocides in history unfolded in real time. Rwanda's tragedy reshaped international law, pushed forward the idea of responsibility to protect, and forced a reckoning within U.S. foreign policy circles. But for Rwandans, it came far too late. The Second Congo War. The Second Congo War, often called Africa's World War, erupted in 1998 and became the deadliest conflict since World War II, with an estimated 5 to 6 million people dead. Yet it remains one of the most overlooked tragedies in modern history, despite the United States playing a quiet but significant role in its ignition and escalation. The war involved 9 African nations and over 20 armed groups, and its roots trace back to the aftermath of the Rwandan Genocide, when millions of Hutu refugees, some of whom were genocidaires, fled into eastern Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The U.S., under President Bill Clinton, had just been globally shamed for its failure to intervene in Rwanda, and pivoted sharply by backing Paul Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Army, RPA, which invaded Zaire in 1996 to eliminate Hutu militias. With strong U.S. military, financial, and diplomatic support, Kagame and Yoweri Museveni of Uganda helped install Laurent Désiré Kabila as the new president of Congo after overthrowing the long-standing dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, who had been a Cold War client of the U.S. for decades. However, Kabila quickly fell out with his former backers, prompting Rwanda and Uganda to invade Congo again in 1998, this time to oust him. The result was a catastrophic regional war, drawing in countries like Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Sudan, each seeking influence, wealth, or security. Meanwhile, multinational corporations, many with ties to U.S. and Western interests, began exploiting Congo's vast resources, including coltan, gold, and diamonds, further fueling the chaos. While the U.S. did not officially deploy troops, it continued to support Rwanda and Uganda, turning a blind eye as their forces occupied eastern Congo and looted its mineral wealth, committed massacres, and backed brutal proxy militias. The Clinton and early George W. Bush administrations also blocked efforts at the United Nations to hold Rwanda and Uganda accountable accountable for their war crimes. Declassified cables and UN reports later confirmed that US officials were aware of the scale of atrocities being committed by their allies. Though peace agreements were eventually signed in 2003, Eastern Congo remains volatile, plagued by armed groups and foreign exploitation to this day. The Second Congo War is a haunting reminder of how American alliances and Cold War-era loyalties, combined with corporate greed and indifference to African lives, helped perpetuate one of the most devastating humanitarian crises of the modern age, largely hidden from Western headlines. NATO's 2011 invasion of Libya and the collapse of the Libyan state. The 2011 NATO-led military intervention in Libya, championed by President Barack Obama, along with France's Nicolas Sarkozy and Britain's David Cameron, began under the pretext of protecting civilians during the Arab Spring, but ended up triggering one of the most devastating state collapses in modern African history, plunging Libya and much of North Africa into chaos that continues to this day. As anti-government protests erupted against Muammar Gaddafi's long-standing regime in early 2011, inspired by revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, the Libyan state responded with violent crackdowns. Western powers, citing an impending humanitarian disaster in the city of Benghazi, rushed a UN Security Council resolution, 1973, allowing for a no-fly zone and the use of all necessary measures to protect civilians. However, what followed was not limited protection, but an all-out bombing campaign that rapidly degraded Gaddafi's forces and led to regime change. The US played a central role in coordinating airstrikes, providing intelligence, refueling jets, launching cruise missiles, and guiding NATO forces, even though it tried to maintain the image of leading from behind. After Gaddafi was brutally killed by rebels in October 2011, the West abruptly disengaged, having made no plans for post-war reconstruction, governance, or security. The result was a power vacuum that unleashed tribal warfare, armed militias, civil war, and the rise of ISIS in Libya, turning the once most prosperous country in Africa into a failed state. Weapons looted from Gaddafi's arsenal spread across the Sahel, fueling insurgencies in Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and beyond. The intervention also led to a massive migration crisis, as Libya, previously a transit and destination hub, became a launching pad for dangerous boat journeys across the Mediterranean, with thousands drowning in the process. While Obama later called Libya his worst mistake, he placed much of the blame on European allies for failing to follow through, though it was under his leadership that the war was legitimized and executed. The Libyan tragedy exposed the dark side of humanitarian intervention, the willingness of Western powers to topple regimes without responsibility for what comes after. For Africa, it was another chapter of external interference masked as liberation, leaving behind shattered institutions, ruined lives, and regional instability, while the architects of the war moved on with no accountability. afriCOM and the ongoing U.S. militarization of Africa, 2007 to present, the establishment of afriCOM, the United States Africa Command, in 2007 under President George W. Bush, marked a new era of American involvement in Africa, not through overt colonial-style domination, but via a sprawling militarized network of shadow warfare, intelligence operations, drone strikes, and proxy partnerships that continues under successive administrations, including Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. afriCOM was launched under the guise of promoting regional security, counterterrorism, and stability, but in practice, it has entrenched a permanent U.S. military footprint across the continent, with at least 29 known military outposts in over 15 African countries, including Djibouti, Niger, Somalia, Kenya, and Cameroon. One of its most infamous hubs is the drone base in Agadez, Niger, a $110 million installation that serves as a launch pad for surveillance and lethal drone strikes across the Sahel. afriCOM has played a central role in so-called counterterrorism operations against groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and ISIS affiliates in Libya and the Sahel. Yet its actions have often exacerbated violence, provoked civilian casualties, and strengthened authoritarian regimes that use U.S. support to crush internal dissent. The command operates with minimal oversight and little public transparency, relying on special operations forces, private contractors, and intelligence agents to carry out missions that rarely make headlines but have deadly consequences on the ground. Under Obama, afriCOM expanded dramatically, and though he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, his administration carried out hundreds of drone strikes in Somalia and Libya, often with unclear legal justification. Trump took a more transactional approach, deepening relationships with repressive regimes willing to fight terrorism, while Biden has quietly continued these policies under the radar. Despite its stated goals, afriCOM has failed to reduce terror threats meaningfully, and instead, militant violence has surged in the very regions the U.S. operates, especially in the the Sahel, which is now one of the most unstable areas on Earth. Moreover, afriCOM's presence fuels anti-American sentiment, undermines local sovereignty, and replicates the old colonial playbook with a modern twist, where military partnerships mask economic and geopolitical exploitation. Critics argue that this ongoing militarization serves U.S. strategic interests, not African stability, and that afriCOM has turned Africa into a testing ground for endless war, erasing any pretense of supporting democracy or development in favor of surveillance, extraction, and control. I know you were expecting more video like this. So, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.